Talk. My name is Aaron, and today we have a guest who has, my opinion, the opinion of lots of other people, an incredible background of knowledge and experience. Lauren Link is a registered dietitian and board certified specialist in sports dietetics. She graduated from Purdue University, where she was a member of the 2007 Big Ten champion women's soccer team, and is now the assistant athletic director for sports nutrition, working specifically, if I still have this correct, with football, men's basketball, volleyball, and the soccer team there. So she's here to talk to us today about hopefully some of those experiences, as well as her new book titled Nutrient Timing, Fueling Strategies to Unlock Peak Performance. So again, thank you so much, Lauren. I definitely appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Now, let's go ahead and get started. One of the questions that I like to ask right off the bat is kind of how you became interested in this field, what got you started in the career of sports dietetics, and like, I guess, when did you realize, like, hey, I want to work in sports dietetics or nutrition?
Yeah, I mean, I was interested initially in nutrition after seeing some family members struggle with health issues related to weight or, nutrition. And then when I got to Purdue, I played soccer, as you mentioned. And so pretty early on, it felt like a very natural fit. Like I was loving the topic of nutrition. I was actively being an athlete myself and starting to wonder, how could nutrition impact my performance? I wish I would have wondered a little bit more in hindsight. My teammates, I wish they would have too. But it was a very natural fit for what I was doing and living every day. The biggest thing was that it was not really a plausible field at the time. When I was in school, there was 5 full-time dietitians at the collegiate level, and now I'm one of 6 dietitians on my staff here at Purdue. So it really has exploded and made it, a valid career field at this point. But that's what got me interested.
Okay. Like I said, it sounds like you have a full staff, and that's probably good, because one of the reasons that I am so appreciative of you spending a little bit of time, it sounds like you've been a busy woman. So obviously anyone that follows sports knows that your basketball team made it to the NCAA championship. So congrats on that awesome season. And I know, being in Champaign, I mean, there obviously is a little bit of rivalry between University of Illinois and Purdue, but I would say as a Big Ten fan, it was exciting watching that journey. So I guess going through that, and someone in your position, you mentioned that you have, I think, 6 staff members. What is it like going through a season like that, in terms of like how busy you are, like how on track you have to stay of, all the athletes that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a busy life. I think anyone in athletics would agree. At the end of the day, it's going to be more hours and weekends and holidays and things like that than maybe most jobs would. But it really depends on the team and the sports that each dietitian works with. To some extent, every sport has kind of different needs. Every coaching staff might have different requests. It varies a little bit. But I would say overall, at any given time, we're always available for our athletes, like, to meet one-on-one. Okay. So if any nutrition issues come up, we're going to be, housing or fielding those rather. We do a lot of team education. And again, it depends on the time of year too. So you talk about basketball season. It was a very fun ride. It was a good time. And once we get into season, it's a lot more logistical, hands-on type of stuff, so in the off season, we're going to be doing more of the body composition measurement, sweat testing, education around kind of the basics and things like that, the one-on-one consults. Once we get into the season, it's a lot more logistical handling of meals, smoothies after practice, vitamins and supplements, and what can we do from that standpoint. A lot more just like making sure they have the right things available, making sure that they have the right things in their hands, and then monitoring how performance is going. Is fatigue playing a role? What can we do about that? So it really varies from team to team and the time of year. But in a nutshell, busy for sure.
And I'm sure you're probably doing some things with like spring football and obviously, yeah. So very busy there. But I guess one of the perspectives that I was looking at, and you jump right into it in the first chapter of the book, is from my perspective, maybe the one of the most overlooked aspects of nutrition. People think about, I need to fuel my body with the right types of nutrients and whatnot, but you get into obviously the timing of your nutrition and why that's so important. So, well, yeah, we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Why does nutrient timing matter so much?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean,
Yeah.
I do always tell our athletes, obviously what you eat matters, right?
Yep.
But when you eat it is really important too. Even just for the average person, I would say that I always recommend, not skipping meals
Right.
and trying to space out our intake, whether that be through meals or snacks or whatever. And there's a lot of benefits that come along with thinking about when we eat our food. But when you talk about an athlete, there's so many aspects that are really important for timing. And I tell our athletes too, like, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to eat perfectly, but we do need to eat purposefully.
Okay.
And the more elite you get, the less kind of leisure maybe you can afford to just wander throughout your day and eat whatever sounds good at the moment, or, like, you do have to be thinking about it. And so you want to make sure that you do fuel before you would get to a practice or a competition, for instance.
Okay.
You would want to make sure that you fuel right after and support recovery needs. You want to make sure that what you're eating in those time frames, am I having carbohydrates before? That's going to energize me, whereas protein and fat are digested slower, and that might sit and kind of make me feel not great. And so there's a lot of, those are just a few examples that we definitely talk about in the book. But there are many examples, especially like the more micro you start to get when you talk about certain supplements and how we might time those. So I think there are a lot of examples. And when I first approached the book, I kind of remember thinking, man, is there enough to talk about for a whole book about nutrient timing? And then once you really start talking about it, you're like, yeah, actually, like, there's quite a bit that is influenced by timing.
Okay, and you kind of mentioned some of those macronutrients that I think a lot of people think about, but for individuals who don't work around this every day and don't study it regularly, I mean, they do initially think of carbs, proteins, and fats. If you could maybe discuss a little more of each one of those and kind of like what exactly those do for your body in terms of fueling, maybe the timing that you need to utilize some of those.
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, I would say, like, we need all of them.
Yep.
It's easy if you just scroll through your social media page to maybe walk away and think that carbs are evil or terrible or, pick a word.
Right.
But the reality is, like, we do need carbohydrates, especially athletes. I often summarize to my athletes as saying, like, one of the quickest ways to impact your performance negatively is to not get enough carbohydrates. It is our energy source, again, especially for endurance-based sports and even explosive-based sports. I mean, it's fueling like anywhere from 70 to 90+% of that activity that you're doing. So, and it's our main source of fuel for our brain. So if you're someone that uses your brain, hopefully most of us do in some capacity,
Right.
you need carbohydrates present. And so timing wise for that, I think it's often like more about consistently getting them in, especially when you think about that activity piece. Like, are we getting carbohydrates before and during, especially, and even after activity? Protein wise, I think we usually think of muscles, which is fair. That is, they do help rebuild and build new lean muscle proteins. And so again, it's like kind of like a broken record, but consistently getting them in. I think sometimes people will backload protein a little bit. Maybe we have a lunch at dinner, but we kind of neglected it for breakfast. It's important. Our body is synthesizing protein all day long. So it's important to include it regularly. And then fat is the last macronutrient. Again, it's easy to think like, oh, fat is bad for us. We don't want any fat in our diet. And that would just, A, not be very realistic.
Right.
And B, you do need some fat in your diet. It helps absorb fat-soluble vitamins, which are very important, A, D, E, and K. We need some amount of body fat on us. It has a lot of functions for our body. But with that said, most of us don't have to like purposely be thinking about adding fat in to our plate. It kind of works its way in. And so it is important. I think what I would boil down all of this to say is that it can be hard to take that and say like, well, what should I be eating then? And I would say my general recommendation, and I have a whole chapter about it in the book, is it's that balanced plate approach. So I ask my athletes to be thinking like anytime you sit down and make a plate or look at the plate you're eating, we should look down and have a third or so from carbohydrate rich foods, a third or so from protein rich foods, and then a third or so from fruits and vegetables, which, you know, I don't give fat its own piece of the plate. It works its way in, generally speaking. But depending on goals, you might have to be a little bit more purposeful with fat. So we talked through that too, but that's long-winded. But they're all important.
Right. So I guess in your position, maybe some of your staff's position, do you run into like a lot of those misconceptions then, maybe especially when you have new athletes coming on campus and you're trying to educate them on all of this? Probably a lot of misconceptions that a lot of people in the general public have about how, you know, maybe they've stayed away from carbs, you know, the majority of their teens, and you kind of have to work with them to work that back into their diet.
Yes. Yeah. Even the most elite athletes are not immune to all the bad information that's out there. So yeah, I mean, we do a ton of education, and the reality is for us, you know, in my setting, we have 18 to 22-year-olds, give or take. And so they're also just kind of figuring out life independently. They're figuring out how they're cooking and shopping on their own. And they're trying to do all that while performing at a really high level and still wading through all the BS that all of us see when it comes to nutrition.
Right. Something that I wanted to get into a little bit and kind of get your, I guess, insight on is that I think, speaking of misconceptions, I think there are misconceptions from some in some of the public where some diets will work for everyone. You can kind of have like a generic diet that's going to work for everyone. The truth is, I mean, you know, everyone is different. Every body type is different. So I guess working with athletes and of course, thinking of your basketball team is fresh in our mind. What are some of the differences? Maybe you're taking, you know, a basketball player like Braden Smith, who is closer to 6 foot, maybe 170, 175, compared to obviously Zach Edey, who is closer to 7'4", probably hovering around 300 pounds or so. So I mean, that's probably an extreme example, but how can you kind of relate that to kind of relay the message that everyone is different and everyone kind of needs different types of nutrition maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. Those two are easy to pick out on the roster of like, they probably have way different needs, huh?
Right.
I think a couple of things. I guess one, you know, from a really basic standpoint, everybody, every athlete, however you want to phrase it, is going to have some of the same foundational needs. So, you know, my recommendations would not change from a Braden Smith to a Zach Edey. In regards to some things, right? So like both of those people, and you could do the same thing, not just on the same roster. I could say a female diver compared to a male offensive lineman, you know, the hundreds of pounds different and different sports and needs and all that. But all of these examples, I would say foundationally, like I would want them to be eating regularly. So, you know, not skipping meals, not going this huge long chunk of time without eating a meal or a snack. I would want that plate to be balanced, you know, and the proportions would maybe change. They actually for sure would, depending on the sport and the needs. But no example would I say, well, you just don't need any carbohydrate, or you just don't need any protein. Like they all need it. The amounts might change and the proportions might change. So some of that foundational stuff is gonna, I would say, like be across the board. Now, of course, like caloric needs are going to be different based on body size, based on goals, based on position or sport. The other thing, and maybe like the last thing I would say as a big picture consideration, would just be that any diet needs to be sustainable. And that is the huge glaring problem with the vast majority of diets that we see recommended or that we see people on, is that, you know, if you have to do a diet and you can only if you do a diet and you can only do it for 2 weeks or a week or even 2 months, it's not sustainable. So
Right.
when we work with an athlete or any person, a dietitian's goal is going to be, I want to make sure that you're getting what you need from a caloric standpoint, from a macronutrient standpoint, even from a micronutrient standpoint, but it also needs to incorporate, within your means, what can you afford to eat? What do you know how to make? What do you have access to? And what do you like?
Yeah.
I mean, those all have to factor in, or else anybody that anybody listening here would say, like, yeah, I mean, if I can't afford it, or I don't have access to it, or I don't like it, you're not going to do it very long. So it has to be sustainable. And I think that's kind of the last, outside of that foundational stuff, like once we stack some of those considerations, that's the last piece is like, can you do it? Do you like it? Are you going to follow it? And that's very individualized.
Okay. I guess that maybe we can go in that general direction that you mentioned. How would you separate nutrition, or maybe this is still very individual based on the person, from maybe a swimmer compared to like an offensive lineman? Like I said, completely different body types, completely different sports, probably different needs. How would you break that down a little more? And again, I know this is generalized because we're not talking about specific people, but maybe in terms of those macronutrients and how that might differ.
Yeah, probably the biggest variable from a macronutrient standpoint will be carbohydrates.
Okay.
So you look at an endurance athlete is burning significantly more, probably calories and also for sure carbohydrate. And so they're going to just have significantly higher needs in that sense. Protein would be variable too. And you mentioned an offensive lineman or somebody who, if you have an athlete who's trying to maintain a lot of muscle mass, whose job is to be explosive, to move heavy things, whatever it may be, then yeah, we would want a higher protein intake from that athlete. So really, like, those are kind of the two big variables, is just looking at expenditure and how, what kind of activity are we asking you to do? From a macronutrient standpoint, we would probably just be ebbing and flowing, whether it be the carbohydrate or protein based on the needs of their sport.
Okay.
I guess I would also say that's kind of from a big picture standpoint. If we got a little bit more micro, we would be thinking about like what kind of micronutrients might you need based on the needs of your sport or what you're asking your body to do. Or even just like situational things within your sport. If you're an indoor sport who never sees the light of day because you train for 4 hours, we would probably want to supplement vitamin D, and look at that and test it. If you are somebody who has like a significant tax on a certain joint, offensive linemen, their shoulders take a hit, their knees take a hit. Baseball players, pitchers, like the same arm, same rotation going 100 times, then we would want to look at, like, can we nutritionally supplement something in your diet to support, omega-3s being adequate or things like that. I mean, I could probably list 20 examples, but those are a few things that come to mind.
Okay. Something that you mentioned a little bit earlier was the idea of recovery and making sure that you are getting, like, refueling your body properly for recovery. How can you kind of break that down in terms of, we hear about, the window after training or competition. For those listening, how real is that kind of window that we're looking at post competition or post training, and what are some recommendations that people can use in terms of getting the right type of recovery?
Yeah. So, if you had asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have said, oh yeah, the window, we've got about 30 to 45 minutes of kind of optimal recovery. And research has continued to show that is maybe less of a thing than we initially thought.
Okay.
But I would still say it's a thing. I mean, we know that you finish a workout and you've just put your body through a lot, presumably, right? So we've presumably used a lot of our glycogen stores, which is our stored carbohydrates, kind of like our fuel tank, if you will. And we've also presumably put our muscles through a lot. We have taxed them. We've created a bunch of little rips and tears in our muscle. And now we're asking our body to correct these things. And so
Right.
even though we don't have maybe as much of a like magic window as we once talked about, it is still worth noting that the closer you are to finishing that workout, the more efficient you are at some of those processes. So like you
Okay.
can more efficiently replace glycogen in that kind of, I usually use like a 45-ish minute window from finishing
Okay.
as a good recommendation or a good goal for an athlete to aim for.
Okay.
So you're more efficient at replacing glycogen. You're generally more efficient at muscle protein synthesis. But it's also worth noting, like, it's not like you could go 45 minutes, you didn't get anything in, and a timer goes off, and now, like, well, sorry, you missed it. You can't recover anymore. So
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting, yes, more efficient, and it's a good goal to aim for, if nothing else, because it is still important, regardless, to make sure that we're getting consistent meals and snacks in.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's like an achievable goal for an athlete, I think it's good advice. And then in terms of what, or, you know, why, maybe we often talk about, it's a little bit cheesy, but like the 3 R's. So you want to rehydrate because we've been sweating. So we want to get fluid in. You want to recover. And that's that protein piece, which I think gets the most attention post-workout. So we do want to provide protein for muscle protein synthesis. And then we want to fuel. We want to give our body some carbohydrate to replace that glycogen store that we have used up. So carbs, protein, fluid are the big components of recovery. And the better we can be about getting that recovery in, I would say, like, the better situation you're going to put your body in to be ready to turn around and do it again. And that's, again, right, especially for elite level athletes, we're reminding them, like, we're asking you to come back and do this later today, or if nothing else, like tomorrow morning. So we have to be efficiently replacing these things and be ready.
And is that a big learning curve for some of the athletes that you work with, or just in general at that level? I mean, you're thinking maybe in high school they're competing. Well, I mean, a lot of athletes do compete year round now, but in terms of they're thinking, hey, I'm just going to get a meal like right after my game or something like that. But at the collegiate professional level, it seems so much more intense. So maybe that nutrient timing is even more important to make sure that you get that in.
Yeah, I think a couple of things happen. You know, when you talk about a high school to collegiate jump, especially, the thing we're always trying to remind our athletes is, like, everybody's good now.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've been at the high school level, and yeah, you know, it's challenging, but you were probably the standout. Like, if you're here, you were probably, without an immense amount of effort, the best one on the court or the best one on the field or whatever. Now, welcome to the Big Ten. Like, everybody was that person. And so I think, one, it can just be kind of a wake up call of, like, oh, like, I kind of need to elevate what I'm doing in some of these areas. And oftentimes maybe the biggest surprise, I think, for athletes is just the pace of play, the physical asks that, you know, that they have in the weight room, that they have for conditioning. I mean, everything is just elevated. And certainly you could say the same thing about professional too. I think, though, there's often less of a jump because they've been doing it at a high level, whereas high school, it feels a little bit more extreme of a jump.
Okay, so at the collegiate level, a lot of the athletes are fortunate to have someone like yourself, your staff members who I'm sure do a wonderful job. But for anyone else that might not have a dietitian on hand to help answer some of these questions, you know, everyone's busy right now. Everyone says they're busy, whether you have multiple jobs or playing multiple sports, whatnot. What are some strategies or recommendations you can make to kind of help people stay on track and maybe kind of maybe help organize their nutrition a little bit so that they can pay closer attention to this type of thing?
Sure. I mean, one of my first thoughts comes back to that sustainability piece. I think one of the biggest reasons that people let nutrition goals fall off is because maybe whether they see it on TikTok or Instagram or you name it, they hear it from a friend or a coach, like, they just take some cookie cutter plan that they've heard and say, like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that too. And the reality for most people is that it's probably not going to work all that well if it's not catered to what you need. So I think picking something sustainable up front is huge. And that might also just go right along with like choosing, maybe it's like a few small goals to work on, not trying to overhaul every single thing at once. And then kind of along the same lines, but especially if you're talking like younger athletes or actually, I mean, I suppose even older athletes who are trying to manage like a job or a family or something in between as well, finding some amount of time to like prep and plan, which I think can feel really overwhelming, because when we hear meal prep, we think of like the bodybuilder meal prep where we see 50 Tupperware on the counter and we're cooking all day and whatever. And it doesn't have to be that. You know, we can meal prep by making a list for the grocery store and picking 2 things to make more of that week than we will eat in one sitting. Portioning it out, making sure that you think about like, what am I going to have post-workout if I have an hour drive home? Can I pack a shake? Can I, you know, like using some of those convenience products to your advantage. So I guess those couple things maybe come to mind the most in terms of like big picture thoughts would be make sure it's sustainable and put a little bit of time into planning it, so that you can actually carry it out. And maybe the last piece would just be like accountability. Know yourself. Are you someone that can hold yourself accountable or not? You know, and most of us can be pretty honest about that. And so if you're not somebody that is all that accountable, like, okay, make note of that or admit that, and maybe have an accountability partner, somebody that you're checking in with, something like that.
Okay. And if you don't have, for everyone listening, if you don't have a dietitian on staff or someone that you can rely on or speak to directly, I would say reach out and try to find a professional in your area to kind of help answer some of those questions, but also get your copy of Nutrient Timing. I'm serious. We have only scratched the surface of the details and that all the information that's in this book. I promise I wasn't going to take up a ton of your time today, but I do appreciate the time that you've given us today to really talk about this topic and really educate everyone listening and everyone listening now and everyone that'll listen to this later on. So thank you so much. Again, if you haven't got your copy, it's on our website, us.humankinetics.com. Again, so much valuable information in this. With that, I will give you the last word here again to kind of wrap it up and maybe kind of share where people can follow you and keep up with all of your great information and insight.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm linked to Nutrition on here, and X are probably the biggest platforms I use.
Okay.
And I would say whether it's me or some, another dietitian, I definitely, maybe overarching theme would be find a registered dietitian. Whether it's in person or who you're getting your stuff from on social media, but look for the RD credential, because there is just so much misinformation out there. So whether information comes from a book or a page or what have you, I just really, really encourage people to follow legitimate sources, credentialed sources.